My name is Freya. I'm 32 years old, and for most of my life, I've been described with words that sound polite, but feel small, composed, easygoing, low maintenance. The kind of woman who doesn't cause trouble, the kind who blends into the background at family gatherings, the kind people assume will always understand. I work as a compliance consultant now, which is ironic, considering the foundation of my life was built on something deeply unlawful. But I didn't know that for most of my childhood. I grew up in a house of polished marble floors and quiet expectations. I was the daughter of a wealthy, respected family in Boston, private schools, charity galas, summer houses, the kind of life that looks symmetrical from the outside. And yet I always felt slightly, misaligned. Not unloved, not abused, just misplaced, like a book returned to the wrong shelf. For 30 years, I believed I was born into privilege by chance, that I simply had to grow into it. I learned to speak softly at dinners, to smile in photographs, to be grateful, to never ask why. I felt like a guest in my own home. What I didn't know, what no one told me, was that I had never been meant to grow up there at all. 30 years ago, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and resentment, my biological father made a decision that would fracture two families. He swapped me with another baby, not out of desperation, not out of poverty, but out of revenge. He believed the wealthy couple in the room next to my mother had ruined his life years before. So he did the only thing he thought would balance the scales. He placed his child inside their world like a delayed detonation. He never loved me. He used me. He sent me into that family as a pawn, to quietly dismantle them from the inside. Except he underestimated one thing. Me! This is not a story about explosive revenge. There are no screaming confrontations or dramatic confessions in the rain. What happened was slower, quieter, psychological. It unfolded over years, through patterns, silence, documents, and choices. I won't dramatize it. I won't villainize anyone beyond what the truth requires. This is simply the story of how I discovered I was never where I was supposed to be, and how I decided what to do with that knowledge. Have you ever felt like you were living someone else's life and didn't know why? If you asked my family to describe me growing up, they would say I was the steady one, not the brilliant one. That was my older brother, Daniel. Not the charming one. That was my younger sister, Claire. I was the steady one, the child who didn't need extra attention, the one who didn't slam doors, the one who quietly fixed her own problems before anyone noticed they existed. At dinner parties, I was introduced last. "This is Freya," my mother would say, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "She's very independent." Independent was a polite word for self-contained. I learned early that emotions made people uncomfortable in our house. Success was praised, poise was admired, but need was inefficient. And I rarely needed anything, at least not visibly. I remember one particular Thanksgiving when I was 12. An extended family crowded the dining room, crystal glasses chiming softly. My uncle asked Daniel about his debate championship. Applause followed. Claire performed a short piano piece on request. More applause. When someone finally turned to me, it was my grandmother. "And what have you been up to, Freya?" I had just won a regional writing competition. I'd worked on that essay for weeks. I remember holding my fork carefully and saying, "I wrote something that won an award." "Oh," she smiled vaguely. "That's nice." Then she asked Claire to play another song. It wasn't cruelty. That's the strange part. It was indifference. And indifference is harder to protest. I wasn't mistreated. I had every material advantage. The best schools, tutors, summer programs in Europe. When I needed something practical, it appeared. But affection felt procedural, scheduled, like quarterly reviews. My father, the man I believed was my father, valued composure above all. He respected discipline. He respected outcomes. He respected restraint. I gave him all three. He would look at my report cards and nod once. "Consistent," he'd say. And somehow that word felt both like praise and a ceiling. I didn't rebel. I didn't experiment wildly. I didn't embarrass the family. I studied law for 2 years before realizing I was more interested in systems than arguments. I transferred into regulatory compliance, something that required attention to detail but not public spotlight. It suited me, or maybe I suited the role. Looking back, I realized something unsettling. I was always slightly outside the emotional center of the family. Photographs show it. I stand just a fraction apart. Not excluded, just not quite aligned. At the time, I interpreted that as personal inadequacy. Maybe I wasn't warm enough. Maybe I wasn't impressive enough. Maybe I simply hadn't earned the intimacy everyone else seemed to access so effortlessly. So I worked harder to be useful. I organized schedules. I handled small crises quietly. When Daniel had a minor financial mistake in college, I helped him restructure his payments without telling anyone. When Claire panicked before performances, I stayed backstage and timed her breathing. I became infrastructure, reliable, silent, structural. They trusted me with logistics. They trusted me with secrets. They trusted me not to disrupt anything. And I thought that meant I belonged. But belonging built on usefulness has a fragile foundation. I didn't know yet that the reason I always felt slightly misfitted wasn't psychological. It was biological. And the truth had been buried long before I was old enough to speak. The first crack didn't feel like a revelation. It felt like paperwork. I was 28 when my mother asked me to help reorganize some archived documents in the townhouse basement. The Whitmores kept everything. Tax returns from the 1980s, handwritten investment notes, hospital receipts in labeled accordion folders. Order was a family religion. Just sort by year, she said lightly. We're digitizing. The basement smelled faintly of old paper and lavender sachets. I remember kneeling on the cool stone floor, stacking folders by decade. It was almost meditative, until I found mine. A pale blue hospital envelope labeled Whitmore, Female Infant, 1993. I didn't intend to open it. I'm not a snoop. Compliance training has wired me to respect boundaries. But it had already been opened before. The flap was slightly bent. Inside were standard documents. Birth weight, APGAR score, and discharge forms. And then there was something odd. A handwritten note paperclipped to the discharge summary. Infant temporarily transferred to neonatal observation for 2 hours. No complications noted. 2 hours. It wasn't unusual medically, but something about the phrasing felt sterile, detached. I checked Daniel's file. No similar note. Claire's? Nothing. Just mine. I told myself it meant nothing. Hospitals move babies for dozens of reasons. Monitoring, staffing, equipment. Still, I slipped the paper into my tote bag. Not to accuse, just to verify. That night, I requested a copy of my birth records through the hospital's online portal. Professional curiosity, I told myself. 2 weeks later, I received an email. Records incomplete. Please contact the administration. Incomplete. Compliance work trains you to hear what isn't said, I called. The administrator sounded polite but cautious. There was a system migration in the early 2000s. Some neonatal logs were lost. Lost. The word settled uncomfortably in my chest. I almost let it go. Almost convinced myself I was manufacturing intrigue because life had been too smooth lately. But then came the second small cut. At a charity gala a month later, I was standing near the bar when an older man approached me. He studied my face longer than strangers usually do. "You're a Whitmore?" he asked. "Yes." He tilted his head slightly. "Funny, you don't look like them." I smiled automatically. I've heard that before. It was a joke in our family. Daniel had my father's sharp jaw. Claire had my mother's eyes. I had something else. Softer features, darker undertones. The man seemed about to say more. Then he noticed my father across the room and stiffened. "Never mind," he murmured, stepping away. It was subtle, but it was deliberate. That night, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror longer than usual. I studied my face not with insecurity, but with assessment. Bone structure, eye color, skin tone. Differences I'd always attributed to genetic randomness now felt like data points. And once your brain categorizes something as data, you can't unsee it. Still, I said nothing, because there was no accusation. No evidence. Just a hospital note and a stranger's hesitation. It wasn't enough to disrupt a family narrative, but it was enough to shift something internally. A quiet awareness that there might be a missing piece. The first small cut doesn't bleed dramatically. It just reminds you that skin can open. And once it does, even slightly, you start noticing every touch. After the hospital records, I didn't confront anyone. I did what I've always done best. I observed. The human brain is remarkable at maintaining stability. When something threatens the structure of your life, it offers alternatives. Rational explanations, softer interpretations. So I rationalized. Hospitals misplace files. Older men at galas project their own assumptions. Genetics is unpredictable. But something had shifted in my perception. I began noticing patterns that had always existed. I had simply filed them under personality instead of anomaly. Family stories, for example. Daniel's birth story was legendary. My mother recounted it every year. The snowstorm, the dramatic rush to the hospital, my father running red lights. Claire's was similar, calm but detailed, filled with anecdotes about her first cry, her tiny hands. My story was always summarized in 2 sentences. Freya was easy, no fuss, she barely cried. No embellishment, no sensory details, no humor. As a child, I took that as a compliment. As an adult, I heard absence. At dinner one evening, I decided to test something small. "Mum," I said casually, cutting into my salmon, "which doctor delivered me?" She paused, just a fraction too long. "I don't remember the name," she said finally. "It was so long ago." She remembered the obstetrician who delivered Daniel. She had sent him a holiday card for years. I didn't challenge her. I simply nodded and let the conversation move on. That was the pattern. Subtle dismissals, small redirections. And I told myself they meant knowing. But there were other moments too, quieter ones. Once, during a family estate planning discussion, the kind wealthy families conduct over coffee instead of crisis, my father made an offhand comment. "Daniel understands legacy," he said. Claire understands image." He looked at me. "Freya understands systems." It sounded neutral, maybe even complimentary. But what he meant was this. Daniel would inherit leadership. Claire would inherit visibility. I would inherit responsibility without recognition. Infrastructure again. I absorbed it without protest, because that had always been my role. The reliable mechanism that keeps everything running without demanding acknowledgement. And here's the part that unsettles me most when I look back. I participated in it. When relatives confused timelines about my childhood, I corrected them gently, and watched them dismiss my corrections just as gently. When my father once introduced Daniel as my firstborn in a speech, then quickly added, "Well, technically second," everyone laughed. I laughed too. It wasn't malicious, it was imprecise. But precision matters to me. That night, alone in my apartment, I replayed it. Technically second. Words reveal more than people intend. I began documenting things. Not obsessively, just carefully. Dates, comments, inconsistencies in stories, differences in how information about me was stored versus my siblings. Not to build a case, just to organize confusion. And yet, there was a deeper layer I didn't want to examine. A feeling that went beyond misplaced paperwork or vague birth stories. It was the feeling of being tolerated rather than known. Loved in principle, managed in practice. When I visited extended family, distant relatives sometimes asked my mother quietly, "Does she take after someone on your side?" As if I were an interesting deviation in an otherwise cohesive design. I had spent years internalizing that as personal inadequacy. As subtle competition, I was losing without understanding the rules. But now a different possibility hovered at the edge of my awareness. What if the misalignment wasn't a failure? What if it were fact? Still, I stayed silent, because accusing your own origin of inconsistency feels like dismantling gravity. And gravity, even when flawed, feels safer than freefall. There's a moment in every system when you realize you're not just participating in it, you're maintaining it. For me, that realization came quietly. Not through confrontation, not through proof, through repetition. I began to see that my value in the Whitmore family had always been conditional on function. When Daniel made impulsive investment decisions in his late 20s, it was me that my father called to review the structure. Not to reprimand him, not to limit him, just to ensure the fallout stayed contained. When Claire's nonprofit faced scrutiny over a donor conflict of interest, it was I who combed through compliance disclosures late into the night. I drafted memos that protected reputations. I smoothed edges that no one else wanted to touch. At family meetings, I was the one who took notes. Not because I was told to, because everyone assumed I would. And I did. It's a peculiar thing, being trusted with everything except emotional intimacy. They relied on my discretion. They relied on my competence. They relied on my silence, especially my silence. One afternoon, during a property acquisition discussion, my father leaned back in his chair and said something that clarified everything. "Freya doesn't get sentimental," he told a business associate. "She understands what needs to be done." He meant it as praise. But what I heard was this. Freya absorbs impact. Freya executes without attachment. Freya will not disrupt the design. I wasn't the heir. I wasn't the face. I was the stabilizer. And stabilizers don't get the spotlight. They gain weight. The more I reflected on my childhood through that lens, the more the pattern sharpened. I was the child encouraged to self-soothe, the one praised for not crying at school drop-offs, the one told, "You're so mature for your age," when I handled disappointment quietly. I had been shaped, gently, efficiently, into someone who would never threaten the family narrative. Useful, reliable, invisible. There were even legal structures that reinforced it. When estate drafts circulated for review, because, yes, in families like mine, drafts circulate early, I noticed subtle language. Daniel, primary stewardship responsibilities. Claire, public representation and foundation oversight. Freya, administrative and structural governance. Administrative. Structural. Even in inheritance, I was infrastructure. And here is the strange thing. I didn't resent it at first, because usefulness feels like safety. If you are essential to how something functions, you cannot be discarded. At least that's what I believed. But as the hospital records lingered in my mind, a different interpretation emerged. What if I wasn't shaped into this role organically? What if I had been placed into it? What if, somewhere beneath decades of subtle expectation, there was an origin that had nothing to do with destiny and everything to do with design? I began studying my father more carefully. Not the man who raised me, but the man behind the precision, his grudges, his history, the lawsuits he rarely mentioned but never forgot. There was one name that surfaced repeatedly in archived correspondence: a rival family, old financial disputes, allegations of intellectual property theft, a collapsed partnership decades ago. The same year I was born. Coincidence is possible, but systems rarely operate on coincidence alone. For the first time, the idea formed clearly. I might not just be misaligned. I might have been positioned. And if that was true, then my silence had never been neutral. It had been part of something larger. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no slammed door, no dramatic confession. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, under fluorescent lighting, in a hospital records office that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old carpet. I had requested an in-person appointment to review archived neonatal logs. I framed it as a genealogical inquiry. People rarely question ancestry research. It sounds harmless. The records clerk, a woman in her late 50s with careful handwriting and tired eyes, led me to a small consultation table. She placed a thin binder in front of me. "We found partial microfilm backups," she said. "Not everything survived the migration." Partial. That word again. I opened the binder slowly, my movements measured, as if I were handling fragile evidence, which, in a way, I was. Page after page of typed entries. Infant ID numbers, mother's name, time of birth, room assignments. Then I saw it. 2 entries, 12 minutes apart. Whitmore, female infant, room 312. Hale, female infant, room 314. The surname Hale tightened something in my chest. I had seen that name before, in my father's archived legal correspondence. A rival, a collapsed partnership, a decades-old dispute. The times aligned too closely. The rooms were adjacent. And then there was a handwritten annotation beside my entry. Transferred to observation per request. Per request. Not a medical necessity, not an equipment issue. A request. My breathing didn't quicken. My hands didn't shake. Instead, everything inside me went unnervingly still. The clerk noticed my silence. "Is something wrong?" "No," I said evenly. "Just confirming details." I took photos with permission, signed a release form, thanked her. I walked outside into the crisp October air and sat on a bench across from the hospital entrance. People moved in and out. Anxious fathers, exhausted nurses, new mothers carrying fragile beginnings. 30 years ago, 2 babies left that building. One went home to wealth. One went somewhere else. And for the first time, I allowed the possibility to settle fully. I might not be a Whitmore. The thought didn't devastate me the way people imagine such discoveries would. It clarified me, like adjusting a lens that had always been slightly out of focus. Memories rearranged themselves instantly. The lack of resemblance, the emotional distance, the subtle positioning into roles that felt engineered rather than natural. And beneath it all, my father's old grudge against the Hale family. If I were placed into the Whitmore's world, then where had the Hale child gone? And who exactly had requested that transfer? I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I didn't confront my parents. Instead, I opened my phone and searched public records for the Hale family. The business still existed, smaller than before, private, quiet. Their eldest daughter's name appeared on the company website. Born the same day I was. Raised in a modest suburb outside the city. I stared at her photo for a long time. She had my eyes. Not similar, identical. That was the moment something inside me shifted permanently. Not rage, not sorrow, authority. Because if my life had been positioned deliberately, then whoever orchestrated it had assumed I would remain unaware. They had assumed I would remain infrastructure. They were wrong. That day, sitting on that bench, I made no declarations. I made no promises. I simply understood something with an absolute clarity. If I had been placed into this family as part of a strategy, then I was no longer obligated to play the assigned role. Silence until then had been habit. From that day forward, it would be a choice. There's a difference between not speaking and deciding not to. Before the hospital records, my silence had been instinctive, protective, almost reflexive. I avoided disruption because disruption felt dangerous to belonging. After that Tuesday in October, my silence sharpened. It became intentional. I didn't confront my parents. I didn't hire a lawyer. I didn't contact the Hale family. Not yet, because information, when revealed too early, loses leverage. Instead, I returned to my routines with careful precision. Sunday dinners, quarterly family meetings, charity events where my mother's pearls caught the light just right. But I watched differently. At the next dinner, my father discussed a pending acquisition. Daniel argued about the valuation strategy. Claire talked about donor optics. I observed my father's micro-expressions when the Hale company name surfaced casually in market analysis. The smallest tightening of his jaw, a pause that lasted less than a second. He still tracked them. 3 decades later, that told me everything. Silence in rooms like ours is often mistaken for compliance. When I didn't react, when I didn't question, when I didn't accuse, they assumed I remained aligned. They mistook composure for ignorance. It gave me room. I began requesting historical corporate filings under the guise of professional research. The Hale-Whitmore litigation from the early 1990s. Partnership dissolution documents. Settlement agreements. There had been no formal settlement. The partnership collapsed amid accusations neither side could fully prove. My father's career recovered quickly. The Hale family didn't. Resentment without closure calcifies, and my birth year sat directly in the center of that fracture. One evening, while reviewing archived deposition transcripts, I found a line that chilled me more than the hospital log ever had. My father, under oath, had said, "They took something that was mine." At the time, he meant intellectual property, but the phrasing lingered. Took something that was mine. What if he decided to take something back? Silence allowed me to study without alarming anyone. I continued fulfilling my expected role, drafting compliance memos, advising Daniel quietly, protecting Claire's foundation from regulatory missteps. I was still in infrastructure, but now I understand the blueprint. And once you understand a structure, you can redesign it. There were moments temptation whispered. Confront him at dinner. Slide the neonatal log across the table. Watch his composure crack. But emotional exposure benefits the unprepared. I preferred preparation. I ordered a private DNA test kit, not the kind advertised loudly online. A discreet clinical laboratory that required notarized identification. Chain of custody documentation. If I were going to dismantle a 30-year lie, it would be with evidence that couldn't be dismissed. While waiting for results, I practiced something new. Detachment. Not coldness, not cruelty. Distance. When my mother complimented my level-headedness, I smiled. When my father delegated another structural task to me, I completed it. But internally, I began shifting loyalty away from narrative and toward truth. The DNA results arrived on a Thursday morning. Probability of biological relation to Whitmore lineage, 0%. I stared at the number for a long time. Then I closed my laptop. No tears, no collapse, just confirmation. Silence from that moment forward was no longer about belonging. It was about timing, and they still believed I was the quiet one. When people underestimate you, they rarely monitor you. That was the advantage. After the DNA confirmation, I didn't feel urgency. I felt clarity, and clarity creates patience. The first thing I did was secure my documentation. Certified copies of hospital logs, the DNA report with laboratory authentication, archived litigation transcripts from the early 1990s. Digital backups are stored off-site, physical copies sealed in a safe deposit box under my own name, not linked to any Whitmore trust structure. Then I began studying the Hale family more closely. Not socially, not emotionally, structurally. Their company had downsized after the partnership's collapse with my father. It had never regained its original scale. Public records showed multiple refinancing cycles in the late 90s. Personal property records indicated they had sold their primary residence the year after I was born. And then there was their daughter, Eleanor Hale, born 12 minutes after me, raised in a different hospital room. She had studied biomedical engineering, not finance, not law, a completely different orbit. Her professional history showed no connection to the Whitmores, no lawsuits, no public statements, no proximity. If my biological father had intended to use me to destroy the Hale family from the inside, something hadn't gone according to plan. Because I had grown up inside the Whitmore household, not the Hale one, which meant the swap hadn't placed me into my biological family's rival. It had done something more complex. It had inserted his child, me, into the rival's wealth. Not to sabotage them directly, but to weaponize inheritance. The realization unfolded slowly over weeks. If the Hale infant had grown up in a modest household, and I had grown up in affluence, then the damage wasn't emotional. It was financial. My father hadn't tried to infiltrate their family. He had deprived them of their own child's access to generational wealth. He had ensured that his bloodline would sit inside the Whitmore estate. Not as an attacker, as a beneficiary. It was revenge through misdirection. And they never noticed. Not my parents, who believed they were raising their biological daughter. Not Daniel or Claire, who saw me only as their steady sister. Not even the Hale family, who likely never questioned the infant they brought home 30 years ago. The audacity of it was almost mathematical, and I began preparing accordingly. First, I quietly adjusted my personal finances. I reduced reliance on Whitmore's discretionary transfers, increased independent income streams, diversified accounts into institutions unconnected to family holdings. Second, I reviewed estate drafts more carefully than ever before. There was a clause, subtle, almost invisible, allowing redistribution of certain trust assets in cases of proven lineage discrepancy. It had likely been included decades ago for unrelated contingencies, but now it was leverage. Third, I reached out, carefully, to a genetic genealogist under a confidentiality agreement. I wanted irrefutable lineage mapping, extended family markers, cross-reference with Hale ancestry. Weeks later, the data confirmed it beyond doubt. I was biologically connected to the Hale line. Not the Whitmores! I didn't contact Eleanor. Not yet. Because this wasn't about an emotional reunion. It was about correcting architecture. Meanwhile, at family dinners, I remained the same. I listened. I advised. I documented. Daniel once joked, "Freya's like our internal audit department." He laughed. I smiled. They never noticed the shift in my posture. The stillness had changed quality. It wasn't compliance anymore. It was containment. My biological father, wherever he was, had believed he was playing a 30-year game. What he never accounted for was this. He raised his daughter to understand systems. And systems can be reversed. Leverage is rarely loud. It doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself slowly, like a watermark emerging under light. I found mine on a quiet Sunday morning, sitting at my kitchen table with 3 documents spread neatly in front of me. My authenticated DNA report, the neonatal transfer log noted per request, a copy of the Whitmore Family Trust Agreement, specifically Article 7, Lineal Beneficiary Designation. I had read that trust dozens of times over the years in my administrative role. I knew the language almost by memory. But this time, I read it not as infrastructure. I read it as an anomaly. The Whitmore Trust was structured as a bloodline vehicle. Assets flowed to the biological issue of Charles Whitmore and Margaret Whitmore. Stepchildren were not automatic beneficiaries. Adopted children required explicit amendment. There had been no amendment, which meant one thing. If biological lineage were disproven, my legal standing within the trust would shift. And more importantly, so did someone else's. Because if I were not their biological daughter, then somewhere another woman was. Eleanor. The Hale daughter was raised outside the Whitmore wealth. I leaned back in my chair and let the implications settle. For 30 years, assets had been accruing under my name as a lineal beneficiary. Education funds, trust distributions, equity allocations, all structured on an assumption that was factually incorrect. The trust included a clause allowing any direct beneficiary to petition for forensic verification in cases of material doubt. Material doubt. The DNA results in my folder were not emotional evidence. They were material. The power wasn't in exposure. It was in timing. If I initiated verification quietly through legal channels, the trust would be obligated to pause distributions pending review. The board, which included external fiduciaries, would be legally bound to investigate lineage integrity. That investigation would require DNA testing across the immediate family, and that would uncover the swap. Not as a scandal, as a procedural correction. The brilliance cruelty of my biological father's plan became fully visible then. He had assumed I would either never discover the truth, or that if I did, I would protect my own financial security, because exposing it would destabilize my own position. He underestimated something fundamental. My moral code. I don't protect structures built on fraud, even if they benefit me. I felt no thrill, no triumph, only clarity. The leverage was complete. I had genetic proof of non-lineage, hospital documentation suggesting deliberate transfer, legal mechanism within the trust to trigger an investigation, and most importantly, a choice. Expose it and fracture two families publicly, or correct it methodically through compliance channels where truth is processed as adjustment, not drama. I thought about Eleanor, a woman who had grown up believing she was a Hale. Perhaps she had always felt misaligned too. Perhaps not. Either way, she had lived 30 years without access to wealth that, legally speaking, may have been hers. The room felt very quiet. No fireworks, no cinematic soundtrack, just paper, light, and a decision. For the first time in my life, I wasn't infrastructure. I was the fulcrum. When you hold leverage that can alter multiple lives, the hardest part isn't proving the truth. It's choosing how the truth will land. I gave myself 3 weeks before making any move. Not because I doubted the evidence, but because irreversible actions deserve undistracted thought. There were 3 options. Option 1, do nothing. Keep the information private. Continue receiving trust distributions. Protect my parents from humiliation. Protect myself from destabilization. Let the past remain buried. It would be the simplest path. It would also make me complicit. Option 2, confront my parents privately. Show them the DNA results. Demand explanation. Offer them the opportunity to correct the trust structure voluntarily. This option appealed to the part of me that still wanted a personal answer, a confession, some acknowledgement of emotional impact. But it carried risk. If my biological father had orchestrated this alone, my parents might be victims too. A confrontation without legal framing could become chaos, denial, anger, scrambling to protect reputation. Emotion clouds compliance. And I needed compliance. Option 3. Initiate a formal forensic lineage review through the Trust's external fiduciary board. No accusations, no dramatic declarations. Just a procedural petition citing material doubt supported by laboratory evidence. The board would be legally obligated to act. Independent counsel would oversee DNA verification across all primary beneficiaries. Hospital records would be subpoenaed if necessary. Truth would surface as a process. It would be slower, colder, irreversible. Once initiated, there would be no way to quietly retract it. The trust would freeze distributions during review. The media could potentially access filings if litigation emerged. Family dinners would never feel the same. I made spreadsheets, because that's who I am. Emotional consequences, financial consequences, legal timelines, risk exposure, collateral impact. And then I removed myself from the equations. I asked one question instead. If I had been raised outside wealth, if Elena had been raised here, what would justice look like? The answer wasn't punishment. It was a correction. I wasn't interested in destroying anyone's life. I wasn't interested in humiliation. But I was no longer willing to live inside a structure that functioned on an uncorrected lie. My biological father had weaponized my existence to settle an old grudge. If I remained silent, I would be completing his design. If I exposed it recklessly, I would amplify damage. The only path that aligned with my moral code was institutional, systemic, quiet. On a Monday morning at 9:12 a.m., I drafted a formal notice to the Whitmore Trust Fiduciary Board. Subject line, Petition for lineal verification under Article 7. I attached certified DNA report, hospital neonatal log excerpt, affidavit requesting independent genetic confirmation. The language was neutral, clinical, precise. No accusations, only doubt supported by evidence. Before sending it, I paused for exactly 30 seconds, not because I was afraid, but because I understood that once transmitted, I would no longer control the narrative. I would only control my integrity. Then I pressed send. There was no immediate explosion, no dramatic reply, just a soft electronic confirmation. Message delivered. And with that, The architecture of the past 30 years began to shift. The first visible change wasn't emotional. It was administrative. 3 days after I sent the petition, I received a formal acknowledgement from the Whitmore Trust's External Fiduciary Council. The tone was measured. Your submission has been received. Pending preliminary review, certain distributions may be temporarily suspended under compliance protocol. May, not will. But I knew how these boards operate. Risk containment always precedes investigation. By the following week, quarterly discretionary transfers were paused. Not just mine. All primary beneficiaries. Daniel texted first. Did something happen with the trust? My allocation hasn't cleared. I responded simply, likely a routine review. I'll look into it. I didn't lie. I just didn't elaborate. Silence now wasn't concealment. It was sequencing. The board requested voluntary DNA verification from all immediate family members. The request was framed as procedural, not accusatory. That was intentional. Legal counsel avoids language that implies liability before confirmation. At Sunday dinner, my father mentioned it casually. Apparently, there's some administrative review underway, probably an audit trigger. He glanced at me briefly, not suspicious, just scanning for explanation. I held his gaze evenly. Trusts get reviewed. He nodded once. Daniel seemed mildly annoyed. Claire seemed confused. No one looked at me twice. What they never realized was that I had already stepped slightly outside the structure months ago. In anticipation of possible fallout, I had transitioned my primary residence into a personal LLC, independent of family trust backing. Secured a long-term consulting contract that insulated my income from discretionary distributions. Reduced exposure to Whitmore-affiliated financial institutions. Preparation doesn't eliminate impact. It absorbs it. Within 2 weeks, the fiduciary board formally mandated genetic testing through an independent laboratory. Chain of custody samples. Court-admissible results. My father objected politely. I don't see the necessity, he told counsel in a conference call I was invited to attend as an administrative beneficiary. Counsel responded evenly. The petition meets the threshold under Article 7. We are obligated to resolve material doubt. Material doubt? I watched my father carefully through the screen. There it was. A flicker. Not confusion. Recognition. It lasted less than a second. But I saw it. He knew, which meant he had always known. That realization did not enrage me. It clarified the motive. He hadn't been ignorant. He had been deliberate. The samples were collected over the following week. No one accused me. No one confronted me. They assumed this was a bureaucratic anomaly, a procedural inconvenience. They underestimated how thoroughly the machinery had already begun turning. Meanwhile, I drafted a separate private letter, not yet sent, addressed to Elena Hale. Not emotional, not dramatic, just informational. If and when the results became official, she would deserve clarity from me, not headlines. Every action I took was paced, controlled, quiet. From the outside, nothing appeared fractured yet. Family dinners continued. Charity events proceeded. Business moved forward. But beneath the marble floors and polished smiles, a forensic clock was ticking. And this time, I wasn't infrastructure. I was the trigger. Consequences don't arrive with sirens. They arrive as delays. The first confirmed result went to the fiduciary board, not to us. That's standard procedure. Independent counsel reviews lineage reports before dissemination to beneficiaries, but behavior changes before information becomes public. Daniel became restless. He called the trust office twice in 1 week, something he'd never done before. Claire started asking whether someone made a clerical mistake. My mother began reorganizing drawers that didn't need organizing. My father grew quieter, not angry, strategic. 3 weeks after sample collection, we were asked to attend a formal board session, in person. That alone signaled gravity. The Whitmore Trust boardroom had always felt ceremonial. Dark wood paneling, frosted glass, a long table that encouraged hierarchy. This time it felt clinical. Outside counsel spoke first. Language was precise. Independent genetic analysis has identified a non-paternity event concerning one primary beneficiary. Non-paternity event. That's how institutions describe identity fractures. Daniel frowned. Claire looked between our parents. Then counsel continued. Further analysis indicates a neonatal transfer anomaly on the date of birth in question. Hospital documentation supports potential unauthorized reassignment. Potential, unauthorized, reassignment. The words landed without theatrics. No one screamed. No one stood up. But the air changed. My father did not look surprised. My mother did. That distinction mattered. Counsel turned to me. Ms. Whitmore, as the petitioning party, you are aware of these findings. Yes, I said evenly. Daniel stared at me now. You knew? He asked quietly. I suspected. I requested verification. It wasn't an accusation. It was a sequence. Counsel concluded with the inevitable. Pending formal court acknowledgement, trust distributions under the affected lineal designation are suspended. Additionally, corrective review of beneficiary structure will be initiated. Corrective review, which meant one thing. The architecture was shifting. The board requested confidentiality until legal filings were complete. Public disclosure would depend on court proceedings. We left the building without speaking much. In the car, my mother finally whispered, Freya, what does this mean? I looked at her carefully. It means we need the full truth. She turned to my father. He stared straight ahead. That night, Daniel called me. Is this about money? And he asked. No. Then why? Because I refused to be weaponized, I thought. But I answered differently. Because structures built on false premises collapse eventually. It's better to correct them deliberately. He was silent for a long time. Meanwhile, the Hale family was contacted by court-appointed counsel. Lineage verification required cross-testing, which meant their world was about to shift too. I felt the weight of that. But I also felt something else. Alignment. For 30 years, I had lived slightly off-center. Now, consequences were radiating outward, not as destruction, but as recalibration. Loss began quietly. Daniel's paused investments. Claire's delayed foundation expansion. My father's public schedule has tightened. No one understood the full magnitude yet, but they felt instability. And instability reveals what people value most. My father valued control, and for the first time in decades, control was no longer his alone. Panic doesn't always look frantic. Sometimes it looks like negotiation. Within a week of the board meeting, my father requested a private conversation. Not at the house, not at his office. A neutral conference room at a law firm downtown. He arrived 10 minutes early. Something he only does when outcomes matter deeply. He didn't waste time. You should have come to me first, he said, voice steady. It wasn't anger. It was a calculation. I needed independent verification, I replied. His jaw tightened. You've destabilized the trust. Your siblings are exposed. Your mother is humiliated. Exposed. Humiliated. He framed the damage socially, not morally. I held his gaze. Was it an accident? The silence that followed was the closest he came to confession. 30 seconds, maybe more. Finally, he said, You don't understand the context. That's not what I asked. He exhaled slowly. There were things taken from me, he said. Opportunities destroyed, years of work. They walked away untouched. They, I asked quietly. The Hales. There it was. No dramatic reveal, just confirmation. You swapped the babies, I said, not as an accusation, but as a statement. His eyes flickered, not with shame, with regret that it had surfaced. It was complicated, he said. No, I replied evenly. It was intentional. He leaned back in his chair. I made sure you would never struggle. I secured your future. You secured your revenge. The room fell silent again. I never intended for it to become this, he said finally. It was contained, as if human lives were controlled variables. You used me, I said, not emotionally, just factually. He didn't deny it. And that was the moment I understood something critical. He didn't see it as cruelty. He saw it as a strategy. Meanwhile, legal proceedings had already begun. The Hale family's DNA confirmation matched the Whitmore line. Eleanor was biologically their daughter. The hospital launched an internal investigation under court order. Statutes of limitation shielded criminal prosecution. Too much time had passed. But civil correction was unavoidable. The trust's structure would be amended, assets redistributed, public filings sealed where possible, but not entirely preventable. My father tried one final angle. We can settle this privately, he said. Amend the trust quietly. Avoid formal correction. If we do that, I said, we protect you. He didn't respond. Correction isn't punishment, I continued. It's accountability. His composure thinned slightly then. Not shattered, just strained. You're dismantling your own position, he said. I was never supposed to be in it. For the first time, he looked at me not as infrastructure, but as an independent. And in that look, I saw something unexpected. Not hatred, not fury, recognition. The machinery had moved too far. The board had jurisdiction. The courts had oversight. DNA results were documented. This could no longer be negotiated away over a conference table. 30 years of design were unraveling, not through chaos, through procedure. And procedure, once activated, does not reverse for comfort. The formal acknowledgement came on a grey Thursday morning. Court certified, lineage amended, trust structure redefined. Legally, I was no longer Freya Elise Whitmore, lineal beneficiary. I was Freya Elise Hale by blood, though I had not yet decided what to do with the name. Elena had been notified the same day. She requested a meeting, not with lawyers, not with the board, with me. We chose a quiet cafe halfway between our neighbourhoods. Neutral ground, no marble floors, no legacy portraits. She arrived first. I recognised her instantly, not because we had grown up together, but because seeing your own bone structure reflected in another face is disorienting. She stood when I approached. We didn't hug. We studied each other. You knew first, she said calmly. Yes. And you initiated it? Yes. She nodded once. No accusation in it. I always felt slightly misplaced, she said after a pause. Not unloved, just off. I understand, I replied. We didn't compare childhoods. We didn't compete over who lost more, because loss isn't symmetrical. She lost wealth she never knew she had. I lost an identity I had lived inside for 3 decades. Neither of us chose it. I'm not interested in suing anyone, she said. I just wanted the truth. You have it, I said. And you? She asked. I wanted correction. She studied me carefully then. Why didn't you keep it? She asked quietly. The money, the position. Because keeping it would complete his revenge. But I answered differently. Because it wasn't structurally mine. That seemed to satisfy her. There was no dramatic reconciliation. No instant sisterhood. Just recognition. Before leaving, she said something that lingered. You're not like him. She didn't have to specify who. Back at the Whitmore house, I still call it that, my mother requested one final conversation. We sat in the living room where I had spent countless holidays. I didn't know, she said softly. I swear to you. I believe you, I replied. And I did. Her grief felt different from his. It wasn't strategic. It was maternal. I loved you, she said. I know! That was the strange, complicated truth. Love had existed. It had just been built on a false premise. My father entered the room but didn't sit. You've made your point, he said evenly. This wasn't about a point. It feels like punishment. It's correct. We held each other's gaze. No shouting. No collapse. Just acknowledgement. He had designed a 30-year plan, believing he was controlling outcomes. What he hadn't predicted was autonomy. I hope, I said quietly, that someday you understand the difference between revenge and justice. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The confrontation ended not with an explosion, but with distance. And sometimes distance is the cleanest boundary. There is a strange quiet that follows structural collapse. Not emptiness. Not devastation. Just speak. The legal amendments were finalized 6 months ago. The Whitmore Trust redistributed assets according to biological lineage. Elena stepped into a world she had never prepared for. Cautiously, thoughtfully. I stepped out of one I had never truly aligned with. Financially, I am stable. I built independence before initiating correction. My consulting practice expanded quietly once my name was no longer tethered to Whitmore optics. I moved into a smaller brownstone across the river. Not as grand, not as symbolic, but entirely mine. People sometimes ask, gently, curiously, whether I feel anger. I don't. Anger requires surprise. And once I understood the design, I stopped being surprised. My biological father has not attempted reconciliation. His public posture remains intact, reputation preserved. The hospital faced administrative penalties but no criminal consequences due to the time elapsed. Justice in real life rarely looks cinematic. It looks procedural. I've met Elena several times since that first cafe conversation. We are not trying to force a sisterhood narrative. We are building something slower, informed consent between 2 adults whose lives intersected before memory. She kept the Whitmore surname legally. I kept Whitmore as a professional name for continuity. Identity, I've learned, is layered. Blood matters. Experience matters. Choice matters more. The woman who raised me still calls on Sundays. We speak carefully, but honestly. Love did not evaporate when biology shifted. It simply changed context. As for my father, the biological one, I no longer frame him as a villain. He is a man who allowed resentment to override ethics. That's not cartoon evil. It's human weakness amplified by opportunity. And here is the part that feels most important. For 30 years, I believed my quiet nature made me peripheral. But quiet isn't peripheral. Quiet is observant. Quiet sees patterns. Quiet understands timing. I was never infrastructure. I was in discernment, waiting for activation. If he had hoped to plant a pawn inside a rival family, he succeeded in one way. But he miscalculated the pawn's autonomy. I didn't dismantle the Whitmores. I didn't destroy the Hales. I corrected the architecture he corrupted. And in doing so, I redefined myself. Not as daughter of wealth, not as instrument of revenge, not as displaced child, but as someone who chooses integrity over advantage. There's a steadiness in that choice that no inheritance can purchase. For the first time in my life, I don't feel slightly misaligned. I feel placed, not by accident, by decision. If you've listened this far, you might be expecting a sharper ending, a downfall, a public scandal, a villain exposed in headlines. But realignment rarely looks dramatic. It looks like the paperwork was filed on time. DNA, results acknowledged without denial. Assets restructured, names adjusted, silence where shouting could have been. My father believed revenge required proximity, that you could correct humiliation by redistributing advantage. He treated identity like a financial instrument, transferable, strategic, and contained. But identity isn't a ledger. It breathes, it grows, it chooses. What he designed as a weapon became a mirror. And mirrors don't attack, they reveal. For 30 years, I lived inside a life that wasn't biologically mine. Yet the values I developed, discipline, pattern recognition, moral clarity, those were mine. No swap could engineer that. No grudge could control it indefinitely. There's something powerful about discovering that the role you were assigned is not the role you're obligated to play. I could have kept the wealth. I could have negotiated silence. I could have protected the illusion. Instead, I chose correction over comfort. Not because I'm extraordinary, but because living inside a lie, even a profitable one, slowly erodes something essential. If you've ever felt misplaced, if you've ever sensed that a story around you didn't quite add up, I hope this reminds you that quiet doesn't mean powerless. Sometimes, the most irreversible changes happen without raised voices. They happen when someone decides to align truth with structure. So I'll leave you with this. If you discovered that your entire position in life was built on someone else's hidden grudge, would you protect the life you know or correct the truth beneath it? I'm curious how you would choose.